All right, well, terrific. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Scully. I am president of People's Action for Clean Energy, and we're really excited to be hosting this webinar. It is an update of a study that PACE did several years ago. And I'd like to give just a little background on that study and then turn it over to our sort of keynote speaker, that's Kieran Rudge, who did a lot of the work on the study, and then have a panel of a couple of practitioners, three representatives from the industry who are out there uh, trying to get solar canopies built, to discuss some of the practical issues involved. And the timing of our webinar is not coincidental. We have a legislative session starting in a few weeks. I think it's January 8th, if I'm not mistaken. So this is a great time to be starting to look at what are some ways that we as a state can promote more solar canopies. So that's really the why we're here today. We're thrilled to have so many folks here. The interest in solar canopies has been high from the time we first started talking about this. So we think it's got a lot of potential, and we're looking forward to presenting the new findings of our study, and then getting down to brass tacks. What can we do to get more of these built? Because that's really what this is all about. A couple of housekeeping rules. We will ask everyone to stay on mute during the presentations. We will mute folks during the presentation just to keep the background noise down. We'll have presentations by Kieran, and then we'll have I'll talk a little bit about policy, and then a panel discussion of these practitioners. The event is being recorded. The recording and the slides that you'll see, and also the chat. We typically like to save the chat. This group, as we know, is an active group for conversation. They always have good questions, always have a lot to share. So use the chat. We will save it later. So if you want to put links, helpful links in there, or contact information, do that. We'll make sure all of that is on our website and goes out to participants. Um, so that's, I think, enough for housekeeping. And again, let's just go back a little bit to why we're here. Um, we know that in order to address climate change, we are going to need a lot more clean, renewable energy, right? As we transition to electric vehicles, as we transition to all electric heating and cooling, our demand for electricity is going to increase. And we know we need to get off of our habit of using fossil fuels to produce that electricity. So we know we're going to need a lot more solar. And when you look around and see where are we going to put this solar, you see some interesting developments, right? And we saw this several years ago, that there are increasing conflicts at the siting council in Connecticut and other places where a large solar project might be wanting to be sited. And this often pits environmentalists against environmentalists, because we all want both clean energy, but we also want to preserve our farmland and forests and our wildlife. So this is an issue that's not going to go away. Where are we going to site solar? There's an interesting proceeding going on at DEEP, Department of Energy Environmental Protection, on siting of renewables. They've got some new tools. But it became very clear as we were looking around, solar canopies offer a unique potential for siting solar energy, in that they help us to preserve our farmland and our forest. They take the pressure off. This is real estate that's already really been degraded. It's been used. So Pace set about 4 years ago looking at what would the potential be for solar on parking lots, on impervious surfaces in Connecticut. We looked at a study that had been done in the lower Hudson Valley about the potential for solar on parking lots. We noticed Rhode Island had done an interesting study. We reached out to Kieran Rudge. Kieran, at that time, was a graduate student at the Yale School of Environment. And we put our heads together and said, how can we do our own review? What is the potential of solar canopies in the state, right? And Kieran scoured did a lot of research and found an interesting database of impervious surfaces that University of Connecticut and DEEP had created years ago to look at stormwater runoff. Karen went to town modeling how much solar you could put on these sites, and we came up with some interesting figures. That was 4 years ago, and that study that we reported has certainly gotten a pretty good distribution and has provoked lots of conversation. However, we don't see a ton of solar canopies being built, so we thought it would be time. Let's revisit this question. Let's see if there's any new data out there. Is there any better data that we can maybe update our analysis? Are there any new ways of looking at this? And then importantly, what are some of the policy recommendations, right? We have learned some things in these few years, and we've seen some terrific examples of successful solar canopies. Shout out to Dwayne Escola, who is on the call today and spearheaded the installation of a fantastic solar canopy in the high school in Ridgefield. So it can be done. Congratulations, Dwayne. Thanks for joining us today. But let's find ways where we can get more of these done. So without further ado, I am very happy to introduce Kieran Rudge. And I'm going to just ask one more time if folks can mute. I don't know if there's a way of, I'm going to mute everyone. So everyone is muted right now. So if you're presenting, if you're on a panel, you're going to have to unmute yourself. But for now, everyone is muted just to keep the background noise down. So, give me 1 second. This is what I'm looking for. So, Kieran, it has been an absolute joy to work with Kieran. We worked with Kieran, as I mentioned, several years ago when they were a graduate student at Yale. Kieran is now a PhD student at UC Berkeley in environmental science, policy, and management, and he is the analyst supporting our Canopy work. Their doctoral research work focuses on climate change adaptation, environmental justice, militarization across Pacific Islands. Kieran has previously worked on decentralized solar energy systems, particularly adaptation, planning, and climate change communication. When a couple of months ago, earlier this year, we decided we wanted to update the study, and we knew Kieran had moved on from their work at Yale and we're now at UC Berkeley, but we said we wanted to give Kieran sort of first rights of refusal of the chance to update this work. And we were thrilled that Kieran accepted, and Kieran came back and helped us with this work. And so I'm going to hand it over to Kieran to present the work that they did. So thank you, Kieran.
Thanks so much, Mark. Yeah, hello everyone. Really nice to see so many of y'all today. Mark, just first thing, can I have permission to share
Try it
my
now.
screen, I think? Oh, yeah, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, so as Mark was saying, right, we've really been trying to re-emphasize this importance of solar canopies right now. And with this update, a part of it was adding some new analysis and looking for new data, but then also really trying to bring solar canopies back to the forefront once again. So I'm just going to go through a little bit of what we did originally, and Mark touched on some of that already, and just why this is very important to us, and then what was the new work that we did and how some of the data has changed now. So with solar canopies, right, we're really just thinking about how can we develop renewable energy and address climate change, do mitigation of emissions in a way where we're avoiding the need to encroach upon natural resources. So as opposed to something like in this image here, where there's taking up a large area that was once forested land, how can we think about developing solar that is already on top of impervious surfaces, areas like parking lots, like public rights of way and walkways that have already been developed upon for other uses by people. How can we leverage those areas to further our goals towards renewable state of Connecticut, right? And another big piece of that is we're thinking about a decentralized grid which can generally be more resilient, as a lot of folks will attest to. If we're thinking about producing solar energy in a lot of different pockets that are near to the end users, that can be beneficial when we're thinking about the increased extreme weather coming with climate change and having less fail points as opposed to with more traditional systems with a handful of very large power plants that are being transmitted over very long supply lines. So these are just some of the main points to get into again, is that we're constructing them over parking lots, maybe landfills that could be canopies or ground-mounted solar or other existing land uses where we're adding value by adding these solar canopies on top. This is doing things like preserving farmlands and forests, so trying to bring environmentalists together towards a common goal, and also how can we think about supporting agriculture and smallholder farmers while also developing solar. Thinking about that local distributed energy generation, and then on the user side of someone parking their car or someone who is owning this property, protection from the elements for the vehicles or whatever else is being stored under there. And then thinking about integrating this with other technologies that are important for electrification and a transition to a green energy system. So pairing with electric vehicle charging and battery storage are two very beneficial co-benefits that we can integrate into these solar canopy infrastructure. So it's
Excuse me, Kieran,
supporting,
you, I think
yeah.
your slide is still on the Y solar canopies.
Oh,
So
thanks. Okay.
maybe you need to share your desktop so that the slides advance.
Huh. Okay. It's
There we
good now,
go.
right?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for letting me know that. Okay. Yeah, so with that, we're really thinking about all these co-benefits, as I was saying. And an additional one is thinking through environmental justice. So oftentimes when we're thinking about developing power infrastructure, like renewable energy of solar and wind, this might be happening far away from where a lot of people are living in more rural areas that are underdeveloped. And when we're thinking about solar canopies in places that have developed impervious surfaces, that is able to provide benefits if done in the right way for communities that have less environmental amenities, like forested land, for example. So this is evident with urban heat island effect, for example, where solar canopies can help to reduce that urban heat as heat waves are becoming more dangerous with climate change. So we want to think about solar canopies being able to be put on top of impervious surfaces, benefiting the grid, benefiting mitigation, and then addressing some of these climate impacts like urban heat in communities where there's less green infrastructure. Okay, it looks like it's moving now, right, Mark?
Yes.
Awesome. So this is what we did in our previous study. Here's some of the data, and I'll walk through the methods a little bit as well. So this study that we finished up in 2021, we were looking at parking lots across the entire state, and we're limiting it to sort of like larger, medium-sized parking lots with roughly 100 spaces or more, just for the feasibility and trying to get a realistic analysis of places that could host a decent amount of solar canopy production. And so through our analysis that I'll get into a little more, we were able to find there were over 8,000 potential sites to put solar canopies on parking lots throughout the state. This represents about 7,000 megawatts of solar capacity, generating more than 9,000 gigawatt hours of annual energy production. And really what we're taking home here is that theoretically, if all of this was built perfectly with efficient solar panels, right, this could cover roughly 37% of the annual energy consumption at the time in Connecticut. On the right, this graph is showing our study in the green with solar canopies in addition to something like rooftop solar, which has been researched through other methods like using Google's analytical tools. When you're pairing these together, these two forms of generally decentralized energy production can account for almost all of the energy consumption that Connecticut would need. And then I'll show later what these numbers ended up being with our update. But just to demonstrate a little bit about how we got there, here is what we were looking at, where we went through and identified this previous database of impervious surfaces, like Mark mentioned, developed by Yukon and Deep through CT Eco. And then based on this amazing database they had for impervious surfaces to do stormwater mapping, we're able to do some filtering to mainly select the sites that we wanted that were these larger parking lots. And then following up on that, we did a sampling process where we modeled an example of 100 different sites across the state. As you can see on the right, this is an example of what we did in this program called Helioscope that a lot of the solar installers use. And we're able to essentially, this is just one model of many, to demonstrate how can we like optimally fit solar canopies into an area like this. And then from there, from doing sampling across a few sites, we're then able to derive some coefficients and equations to then do a more automated analysis of roughly 10,000 potential sites across the state and do that analysis, like if they were feasible to have development on, and what their capacity might be. And so these are just the main things we ended up looking at where, okay, this shapefile was able to tell us the area of these lots. And then we're saying, okay, based on our sampling and the solar panels that we chose based on conversations with installers, what was the usable area? And then how can we convert that into the estimation of the capacity? And then from capacity, how can we estimate the annual production that's going on across these sites? We did analysis on the town level, on census tracts, and of different cities as case studies. But really, this is a map just of some of the stuff we were showing. And you can see online on our map that you're able to move around and zoom in and out on all the different sites. But really, what we're showing is that on a town by town basis, there are some areas where there's quite a significant amount of the current energy consumption in that town or city, which could be made up by our solar canopy potential sites, right? With the majority of them being in this sort of 25 to 50% range, where if all the potential sites were built, it would make up that proportion of their electricity use. Then we also did some analysis thinking about this justice lens, and thinking about where these panels would go. So a lot of these panels, as we're seeing here, the statewide average of what percentage of energy consumption could be supported by solar canopies in that census tract. So on average, that number is 36.7%. And then the number goes up if a community is low income or if a community was majority non-white income. And then on the far right, you can see that this might not have been statistically significant because when you combine the two, it's about the same as the average. But we took this data and then did some case studies looking at New Haven and looking at Hartford specifically to see if there were more of these environmental justice trends. And we're finding that in some contexts, this could be beneficial for supporting lower income communities in particular, where if the solar development was done in such a way where energy users within that community get a benefit from the solar development, there could be more of it in their community, which is a good finding. So with the 2024 update, here's really the major differences that we had. So the first one was most important to us was, can we find an updated data set? Because obviously from when we did the study till now, there's been a good amount of development. So we wanted to find an updated data set. And also we wanted to revisit and see if we could find additional sites that were missed in our previous analysis. So could we figure out ways that we might have been missing some data? And so we were able to find additional impervious surface data set that was developed by NOAA in 2021. And even though our study came out at that time, our original data was based off of 2012 data set. So really this update that we're doing now is representing a roughly 9 to 10 year time jump in new impervious surfaces being developed. So that was really helpful for us to get this great impervious data set that NOAA was able to develop and build our analysis based on that. And so we were essentially following very similar methods using that new data set and combining that with what we had found previously to really do this analysis again with more updated aerial imagery from NOAA. And then what we were doing in addition to that is we wanted to think about other variables that could be important. And after looking at what could be feasible to analyze and what might be beneficial, we wanted to think about two main things. So one being, where are our sites in proximity to substations? And then also, are these sites next to or on the same property as current solar projects? So the thinking there is with substations, there's a lot of variables that we want to explore further with what the capacity of these substations are, and also more on the interconnections. But really the idea is we want to think about, can this solar be distributed easily? Is there grid capacity to do so? And then secondly, if there is existing solar already, we are thinking we want to highlight those sites as places where the property owners or those local governments and communities might be more open to exploring solar canopies because they've already done solar development. And we just want to share, hey, on your site, you have opportunity to do even more great solar development with canopies. So here are new numbers that we have. So on the left, this is the combination of our new data and the revised version of our old data. So really is what we're looking at now is what our study showed is that we're looking at 9,096 total sites across the state, representing 7,500 megawatts of capacity and 9,700 gigawatt hours of annual energy production. This equates to essentially the same percentage of the annual energy consumption in Connecticut, which has increased slightly over the past few years. But really, it was a great finding that we were able to find, as you can see on the right, just in the new data, about 4 new sites per town and a total of 680 new potential sites across the state. So really developing this study and keeping it up to date based on the new NOAA data was super helpful to keep the ball rolling and give the most accurate data that we can. And then just getting into these two analyses that we did in addition upon the new sites. So with substations, we wanted to see if there were sites close to the substations, which would oftentimes, but not always, enable more efficient distribution of electricities and enable better management of excess production to meet peak loads at different times. And so following in the footsteps of a few other studies that have done a similar analysis, like a study done by Synapse in Massachusetts, where they modeled a very similar decentralized solar analysis in proximity to substations. So what we did was we looked at, okay, with our sites, putting these different sites into categories of most favorable being within 2 miles, moderately favorable in this middle range of 2 to 5, and then greater than 5 miles being somewhat favorable. There's a lot of nuance to this, and we really wanted to do this analysis in a more detailed way, because another consideration is that when we're having these canopies that are in a 5 mile or greater radius from a substation, that might be less beneficial in terms of integration with the grid, but we were thinking about how these sites can actually be valuable in supporting sort of resilience hubs and um, supporting energy production in places where there's not currently infrastructure can be beneficial for communities that do live out there in more remote places. And here's really what we found, similar to what we've been finding, that solar canopies are found along where development and communities are generally living. So here, 49% of the sites are within that 2 mile range, 41% in that middle range, and then 11% over 5 miles away from one of these major substations. This is again using some data based off like federal databases. Again, that is an incomplete network of like major substations that we had and major grid lines. But based off of these, we have an analysis of the ranges from those substations with the lighter circles being within that close range, and then the more darker blue being those overlaps with the outer ranges. But importantly here, this is what we're finding, where you can see the green is within that 2 mile range, the orange is within that middle range, and the gray are our potential sites that are outside of that range. And then with another mode of analysis, we wanted to think about this coincidence with existing solar, and then I can wrap it up and we can think about the policy side as well. So with existing solar, like I mentioned, we're thinking about this strategy of like snowball solar energy development, where if there are regional hotspots, if there are hyper local hotspots where solar is already being developed, how can we further that? How can we give those people the information they need to see that there's greater potential to continue that solar development? So we want to think about providing analysis and data that supports this organic growth, where there is potential for a canopy in proximity to early adopters of rooftop solar. And so what we found is this is essentially an analysis of solar canopies right next to rooftop solar installations. And we found that of all of our sites, 28% of these potential sites were adjacent to these commercial solar installations. So about 2,500, which represents almost 4,300 gigawatt hours annually of production. And so here you can really just see, and this map can be zoomed in on, which is more helpful to really, and we have like the list of addresses and coordinates of these, where this solar actually is potentially to be developed adjacent to existing sites. And so this last component, really thinking about, okay, with all these 9,000 potential sites, we have a significant potential to produce energy for the state of Connecticut and really move towards these climate action goals. And with that, we just wanted to look through and think about what is this production and roughly what is the emissions mitigation that can be done. So we did a more detailed analysis of this as well to really think about, with our 9,700 gigawatt hours of production, and then also with each of these different analytical groups we created, what can be produced and how much can be mitigated. So we have a lot that we really want to get into more with this, and do more detailed analysis of substations. And some of the proposals we have on more the technical side are to advocate for data that is more current and transparent and analyzable, such that we can have more of a real-time assessment of the viability of all these sites. And then I'll hand it off to you, Mark.
Great, thanks, Kieran. What I would suggest is we're in good time. We've got I think a nice sort of half of the time left to talk about policy, which is great because that's really what I think is the ultimate goal is to move forward. But let's pause here. If there are any questions regarding the analysis that you've done, let's take those. So if there's questions about policies and legislation and how do we get more. Let's hold that because we're going to talk about that in a minute. But are there any questions before we move on the study, the data, the work that Kieran has done here? I'd say either raise your hand or unmute yourself. Probably raise your hand is good. It's in the reactions button, the react button typically on your, so feel free to raise your hand or can always put your questions in the chat too, and we can get to those. But
It
Mark.
looks like Frank had a question.
Yeah, in your analysis, did you take into consideration the current rules in Connecticut as far as like, say, an average homeowner like myself? I have solar power, but it's limited to the amount of energy I use. So was that calculated into the calculations that you have? Uh, that's one question. The other question is, did you also consider highway uh, along the highways, all the where all the barriers are? That's 100 miles worth of open land, basically south facing, and just those two things.
yeah,
Yeah, thanks for that question. And oh, Mark, did you want to start? Yeah.
if you want, do you want to kick it off, Kieran? I can follow up, or you want me to take that?
Um, yeah, sure. So yeah, if you want to speak more about
Yeah, I don't.
the
Yeah,
policy for the homeowners, yeah.
right, both really good questions. We did not look at so when Kieran was modeling how much solar could you fit on a site, you can see from one of the images using this tool helioscope. We estimated what's the potential there. That's what we call the technical potential of that site. And we actually got some advice from some of the installers that you'll hear from a little later, where we did a sort of modeling how much we could fit, and then got their advice. How would you go about this? So I don't think these are ready for actual solar proposals, but they're pretty good estimates. But they're technical, right? We didn't look at what's the local load there, what's the meter, what meter would that attach to. So the viable or the feasible potential, the economic potential is going to be lower because, Frank, as you say, some of these sites there's not enough load there. That is incidentally one of the changes we'd like to recommend. You may know that from that 2 years ago, or actually last year, I think the legislature removed the limit on the NRES, the non-residential renewable energy solutions programs for commercial solar, essentially. You no longer have to limit your rooftop solar to your local meter, right? If you've got a big roof and you don't happen to use a ton of electricity, you can fill the roof, produce more electricity than you need. So that limitation is gone for rooftop. We're suggesting let's do the same for canopies, right? Let's not limit it to local load. Let's put the solar where we have room, for gosh sakes, right? So a great question there, Frank, and hopefully we can address that. But again, technical potential, we didn't build that. And we did not look at rights of way necessarily. The focus here was impervious surfaces. So there are lots of other places along highways, brownfields, things that we didn't look at. This was really, parking lots essentially. All right, well, let's move on.
I think we have another question
Oh,
from
is
Jeff.
there another question? Thank you. I'm not seeing the whole. Is it
Yeah,
in the chat? Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
can you hear? Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, I was
Yes.
just going to comment exactly the same thing. Being co-located or located near a rooftop system might be a negative, at least under current policies, because exactly what you talked about. We can't, we've got a size to load and things like that. So that's not necessarily a positive thing, at least under the current policies. It might be considered a negative in many cases. So.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. All right, well, let's move on. As Kieran said, next focus really is, and I think this was a big part of why we wanted to redo this study because, as we said, we're not seeing a lot of canopies getting built. There are some, but there are still challenges to them. So let's revisit the issue. Let's look at what can we do in tangible terms in regulations. What can each of us do in our towns in identifying sites? But more importantly, what can we do at the state level to make some of these more feasible? And if we can go to the next slide, there's sort of four categories or four high-level strategies that we're recommending. First of all, the Bill 5004 that did not pass earlier this year, the so-called Green Monster, had a provision in there that said DEEP must put together a strategic plan for developing solar canopies. So that did not pass. Maybe we'll get it into a bill this next year. Maybe DEEP could just go ahead and do it anyway, right? But we think this is such the potential of canopies is so great that it really does warrant putting together a plan. How can we go about? So that's the very first, I think, sort of suggestion strategy that sort of doesn't need further description. The next three are, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on those. And what I'd like to do is just tee up some policy strategies. These are in the report, but I want to do that quickly and move on really to the experts, right? The people who are out there in the trenches, literally trying to build these things. So the issue the big issue that of course one runs up against with a lot of these is the grid itself. A lot of these potential canopies are located in places where they simply couldn't be built. The grid does not have capacity. The substation doesn't have capacity, or the circuit does not have capacity. So there's a bunch of stuff that we can do on the grid. The next major recommendation is let's value canopies appropriately. As you can imagine, building a solar canopy is more expensive than putting solar on a rooftop, right? You have to build a structure. So if they're going to get built, we need to recognize their true value, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the issue of local property taxation. So I'll go into these other ones very briefly. So the issue of the grid itself, and what are some ways that we can address the congestion on the grid and the planning of the grid. And there is a lot of work going on in this area. We're certainly not the first to think of this. There is an interconnection working group. There's, of course, the Equitable Modern Grid Initiative of PURA. So this is a very big topic, but a couple of sort of specific things that we see. First of all, these hosting capacity maps. You saw sort of rudimentary versions of them in Kieran's slides. Both Eversource and UI have these maps where you can look at any circuit, look at any location, and see how much capacity is on the grid. These are not conducive to detailed analysis, so we'd love to see better data there. There are ways of looking at of distribution planning, looking at system operators and if you got a potential cluster of projects that would require significant upgrades, ways of socializing those costs. Again, folks are looking at that. One novel idea that was suggested to us, and that is the idea of a flexible solar interconnection. If you want to connect solar to the grid needs to be able to, right now, the grid needs to be able to take that power 100% of the time, right? And that means where the grid might be constrained, you would have to reduce the amount of solar because you can't maybe receive all that solar every hour of every day. Whereas if you say, we allow you to curtail our solar by a certain percentage, say 5%, 10% of the time, where we're producing solar, the grid can't handle it, so we will just shut down. If you do that, it actually has a significant increase in the potential that can be put on the grid as it is today. So not building everything for the maximum peak worst case would go a long way. And then, of course, non-wires alternatives. Kieran talked a little bit about this. These locations that are not near a substation, that are not near existing solar, they may be out where the grid is constrained and the circuits are constrained. Right now, if you want to put solar with a battery storage on there, those are essentially additive resources, right? And they're going to put a strain on the grid. Whereas solar plus storage together actually is not additive, right? The two together can actually stabilize and be a valuable resource to the grid. So the way we look at solar, particularly solar plus storage, putting solar plus storage in an area where the grid is constrained could be an extremely valuable resource for providing local resilience. Next slide. So that was the grid. And then the incentives. Essentially, the theme here is let's value canopies for their true value, right? Right now, they are more expensive, and a lot of them don't get penciled out because of that. Um, we're we would suggest creating a separate category for canopies, where we have example just set up a 25 megawatt tranche or bucket of solar for schools. Let's do that for canopies, right? And there's I think some uh, inventive and creative ways of structuring that, which I'd love to let our panelists talk about. We could change the bid preferences. Um, as we talked about before, when you pair solar with storage, the value of that resource increased significantly. If you look at the value of distributed energy resources or the value of solar study that was done in Connecticut, and you look at this value stack of, what's the value of solar? Well, it's the kilowatt hours you produce, it's the avoided distribution, it's all kinds of inflation and demand effects. Add those all up, put storage next to it, and the value of that resource is much higher. So why not require all sizable canopy projects to include storage? Next slide. And we think let's be creative. We would like to throw out the idea of if there's interest from this group, let's put together a specific solar canopy bill in the legislature. Let's include some of the things we just talked about, and let's be a little creative, right? Maybe let's try to create a proposal, a request for proposal for some mega projects, right? Think of Bradley Airport or some of the train stations or Department of Transportation where you've got massive, or Pratt and Whitney or Electric Boat where you've got massive parking lots. Let's put together a couple major projects, put out a request for proposal there, right? We've seen these in a couple interesting places at airports. Huge potential there, right? Let's start a project to get 20 canopies built in EJ communities within a few years, right? Let's put together the experts that we need, the utilities, the policymakers, streamline interconnection, make sure the ownership and the benefits of these canopies accrue to these EJ communities. As Kieran said, this addresses urban heat island effect. It's a great way to benefit these communities and get some solar built. There's a lot of state properties that could be used. It could be used. Let the state start to identify those, and then help towns identify feasible sites. I think that's the end of the slides, right, Kieran?
Yep, that's the end.
All right, so we'll go ahead and close down the slideshow. And as I said, we're really thrilled to have some experts here as well. And I'm going to introduce our three panelists, three sort of industry practitioners who many of them helped us, and when we were writing this report, in terms of getting expertise and understanding when you're out designing and building solar canopies, what are some of the issues? What are some of the challenges? So I'd like to introduce Joby Moss, who is Director of Business and Development at Verigy, Jeff Hinsky, Vice President Policy at Green Skies Clean Energy, and Jeffrey Maysel, Managing Director of Lodestar Energy. And what I'd like to do is throw out really two questions. We got about 15 minutes left, and we can sort of in about 10 minutes or so transition to some Q&A. So can put your questions in the chat. But really, the question for our panelists really are twofold. First, if I think we've talked already about some of the obstacles, right? The grid, the cost. What are some of the success factors when you've actually been successful in getting a canopy built? What have been some of the reasons you could pull that off? Was it a location? Was it a particular co-benefit? And then secondly, as we look ahead, what are some ways, either on the list we just talked about or some other ideas you have, where we could actually put together a focused set of legislative proposals to get more of these built? So I'm going to hand that over. I'm really give each of our three panelists a chance to kind of address those questions and the things top of mind for them. So we'll start with Joby. Would you like to go first?
Sure. Afternoon, everybody. Mark, to answer your questions, really, I think at least the first one it's as simple as having the necessary revenue profile to get a project financed and built. You know, we live in a capitalist country where really, if it doesn't make financial sense, it's probably not going to happen. And as we've seen, and as Kieran has demonstrated in their study, really that's just not happening in the state of Connecticut right now when these projects are having to compete simply on a price war with rooftop projects or ground mount projects. So from Verity's perspective, the success factors are really just having the necessary revenue levels. That could be done. I'm getting into the second question. That could be done, through a canopy, an actual adder, not just a bid preference, as has been the case so far in Connecticut. So that was the case in Massachusetts and Rhode Island before they closed out their or finished out their canopies goal. Or that could be the case maybe in just a dedicated carve out for canopy projects within either the NRES or the SCEF program, kind of as is now the case or will be the case in 2025 for the schools project. With any sort of modeling practice to determine, the necessary estimated bid preference or the necessary estimated adder. The one thing you can guarantee about any model is that it's not a perfect reflection of reality. So really just leaving that up to the market and potentially a dedicated canopies category would probably be the most efficient way to get some of these projects built. But I'll pause for now and hand it off to the next panelist.
Great, Jeff. Let's say Jeff Hinsky.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, where we've had some success is when, I certainly echo what Joby says. The financial side of it that's kind of the price of entry, if you will, and they're in most cases, and with the way that current programs are structured, you can't make things work. Where we have had some success though is kind of on when the local company or NARC recently had some success with some schools. They're motivated for reasons other than strictly economics, either because just sustainability purposes or the shade and cover that it provides is enough of a motivation to take little to no additional financial benefit from the solar, that basically covers the extra costs. Looking at policy-wise, obviously, again, echoing what Joby said, adjusting these programs either through carve-outs or adders in lieu of preferences, things like that, clearly make the help drive some of the economic issues. One of the other things that we've run into, I guess, along those lines, the other thing is we talked about this off-taker issue, and if you've got a rooftop solar, you probably you can't easily add a parking lot likely. They're because of the size to load issues for everything but rooftop. You basically get maxed out pretty quickly in a lot of places, particularly places like warehouses or a school parking lot doesn't have, you've got a lot of room and not necessarily a lot of load, particularly when you take summer into account. But the other thing I think that would be helpful maybe is some model building code / permitting legislation, or what we have found, across the state, because these things aren't very common, not a lot of them have been built. There's a lot of jurisdictions that have no experience with them. And you end up having to spend a lot of time pulling permits and going through engineering design reviews multiple times. And generally, we end up having to over-engineer these things because of the inexperience of the local AHJs, and in terms of how the strength of these and things like that. And then there's just smaller stuff like was already just briefly mentioned, runoff and snow and things like that. Different AHJs treat these differently. You know, we're already on an impervious surface, yet somehow they want us to put gutters that are going to take it to a drain area and things. And so there's a lot of disparity, I guess, is probably part of it. So some type of local or model permitting would be very helpful.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Jeff Masel.
Great, thanks, Mark. I mean, I think both what Joby and Jeff have shared are really important features. A programmatic approach that gives you firm economics, land use regulations and favorable permitting. But we've been fortunate enough to have built what we think is the largest solar canopy in New England. It's a 5.3 megawatt in Massachusetts. And that site was really advantaged by our relationship with the landowner. Because when we think about siting solar in general, land use is very important. But also, if you identify parking lots, they're typically owned by universities, cities, the state, landowners who are, getting site control to that project is somewhat protracted process. It's typically an RFP. It's typically a competitive process that may or may not be, lend itself well to the programs we have in Connecticut where you're competing against other projects on a timeline. We worked with an auto recycling facility in Massachusetts to build that array. So looking at the kind of impervious surfaces that Kieran and you've identified are fantastic. Some additional challenges that come up in that analysis are, what are the subsurfaces? You may have we worked with Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, who had a fantastic parking lot. We signed the deal. We went out and did some site discovery and understood that they had some septic leach areas and other subterranean issues underneath the parking lot. So it didn't work. But, kind of getting that discovery, subterranean information kind of sunlit in this analysis would be something that, would probably help us screen opportunities and accelerate the potential for some of these sites. In Connecticut, we have I think, as everyone has pointed out, but it bears mentioning again, a current program that canopies compete against other projects, and that cost competition, even with the enhancements, is still not enough to enable it. Massachusetts had a 5-cent adder when we built the previous array. New regulations were announced in straw proposal in July and released in final version today, in fact, that is increasing that 5 cents to 8 cents. So when you look at the kilowatt cents per kilowatt, they're adding 8 cents to every kilowatt hour in Massachusetts under the smart DOER regulations that were released today. And that's going to be super important in accelerating deployment of more canopies.
Terrific. Thanks, Jeff. We've got a couple questions in the chat. One, Kathy, I know Kathy Fay mentioned Resilience Hub, and this is a term that's used loosely to mean different things. Really, what we mean by resilience hubs here is the idea that if you have an area where the grid is constrained and the wires or the substation doesn't have the capacity, right? And the grid goes down. If you have a resource that is simply solar and storage paired together, right? And if they're sized appropriately, and let's say, so it has the potential to serve as what could be called a resilience hub. It's not necessarily a resilience hub yet. Resilience hub would typically be something like an emergency shelter, like a school or a church or a building where you've got some generation, you've got solar, you've got a battery, so that you can actually provide power during a grid outage, during an emergency, provide resilience, keep people safe, keep medical devices charged. So there's various forms of that. But the idea of right now, if you put solar and storage together, the utility looks at that as sort of basically adding the two together as being a drain on the grid. And in fact, they actually can be stabilizing and support the grid. Kathy, you also had a question about the SCEF program, and whether the current financing structure for SCEF. I mean, I guess the question for the panelists: could a canopy work under SCEF?
I mean,
I'll just I would say they haven't worked under SCEF previous. There's some tweaks to this year's program that we haven't fully evaluated yet. They've increased the preference to 40% and allowing a higher bid cap that might allow it to work, but we haven't studied it enough yet because that was just released Monday or Tuesday or whenever that was.
yeah, I would echo what Jeff said. Obviously, historically, they have not been able to. I think in theory they could, but just the fact that they're having to compete against greenfield projects that have much lower cost of development makes them generally infeasible as it stands today.
Got a question from Bernie. If we didn't have to compete in NRES for the limited solar capacity, what rate per kilowatt hour would these projects pencil out at? That may be a hard question. Are they economically viable even if they're more expensive than rooftop? Probably a lot of variables go into that, but any comments from the panel?
Yeah, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of variables. Obviously, it depends on the conditions at the site, et cetera, how big in configuration of the parking lots. Long, wide rows are cheaper to build than a bunch of smaller, narrow rows. But I think generally, total compensation, whether it's through incentives or energy rates or whatever, is ultimately you probably need at least 16 cents kilowatt hour, and that's for good sites.
Okay. There's a question whether there's a story map or a report on the analysis, and we haven't done a story map per se. There is the report itself. Deb put the link there. I'm just putting a link in the chat to a map, and I'll quickly flash it on the screen. This was a map that Kieran created that shows, each dot shows a potential solar canopy in Connecticut, right? These are the 9,000 sites. It's on our website. We'll make sure the link is available to you. But feel free to go and poke around, look at your town. If you click on a town, you'll get numbers of total number of canopies, total capacity. We're happy to then work with you. We've got some materials to maybe approach some of the owners of those sites and see if you can get some developed. If you actually drill down, you can actually see the impervious surfaces, the Kieran model. So it's a really interesting tool that is on our website. We'll make sure the link is out there. I would like to just mention. Let's see. I know any of my colleagues. Are there any other questions in the chat that we want to address? We're about out of time. I think one thing, yeah, Bernie, I'm glad you put some in the chat. I wanted to mention this. One of the opportunities, would you like to say a sentence or two about this multifamily, Bernie?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you, panel. Recently, affordable multifamily buildings, which can be quite large, they can be multi-story apartment buildings, were categorized not out of NRES and into RRES, which is to say there is no megawatt cap on them. And in addition, there's a 37-cent per kilowatt hour sell-all rate associated with them. And recognizing that a tall apartment building might have a small roof, but a large parking lot, perhaps at that 37-cent per kilowatt hour rate, canopies might make sense. So I throw it out as an opportunity.
What I'd like to suggest, I'd like to invite you all in I'd like to thank you all for taking part today. And because you're on this webinar, we're going to invite you to be part of a coalition to promote solar canopies this next session, right? We're going to put together, we're going to winnow down this list of sort of expert policy recommendations that we've got. Try to get it into a bill. And if there's interest in this group, we will let you know. We'll keep you posted on the progress here. But we think going into this legislative session is a bit of a wild card, right? We have had a lot of disappointments in the last year or two in trying to get larger bills passed. So we're thinking let's focus on a focused bill that really addresses what we can do to realize the potential of solar canopies in Connecticut, right? Why not make Connecticut the leader? Let's, like Francis said, they want solar on every parking lot. Let's start to build these things in EJ communities. Let's set them up in a way that the benefits are local. Let's start to build out this resource that really has significant potential, whether it's 36, whether it's 37, whether it's 38%, it's a massive resource. And you saw from that map, one of the interesting things is it's a resource that is located where the people are, where the cars are, where the businesses are, where the electric loads are. So it's got huge potential. So thank you all for taking part. Thank you to our to Kieran, our wonderful analyst, for this fantastic work. Thank you, Jeff Hinsky, Joby Moss, Jeffrey Masel. So this is the start of a conversation that we will continue over the next few months as this legislative session gets going. But please continue to send us your questions and your suggestions about moving this forward. And if you want to work in your own town, we're happy to identify what are the sites in your town that we've looked at, and are there ways of working with you locally to try to promote some of these terrific resources. So thank you all for taking part, and let's look forward to moving this whole issue forward and getting these terrific solar canopies built in Connecticut. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Mark.